Good morning and afternoon to some of you, and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference titled Science and Action to Protect Our Health, the Movement to Achieve Local Ordinances that Prevent the Harmful Use of Pesticides. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE-Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE-Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. And you can find out more at akaction.org and at healthandenvironment.org. Our speakers today are Jay Feldman and Drew Toher of Beyond Pesticides and Pam Miller of Alaska Community Action on Toxics. Jay and Drew will be presenting from a single set of slides, which I sent as a PDF to everyone who signed up for the call. If you don't have that in front of you and need the link again, please email me at diana@akaction.org and I'll send it just as soon as I'm done with the introductions. The timing of this call with Beyond Pesticides staff couldn't be better, as Alaska Community Action on Toxics has been working with the Anchorage Assembly on a pesticide-free Anchorage ordinance that will receive a hearing on April 11th. Beyond Pesticides has long assisted local groups working on pesticide concerns to help them develop successful strategies for reform at the community level, and we'll be hearing a lot more about their work to do that. As with all of our CHE-Alaska teleconferences, we will leave time at the end for discussion and for your questions. Now it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Jay Feldman and Drew Toher. Jay Feldman is co-founder and executive director of Beyond Pesticides, a nonprofit organization which works with allies to lead the transition to a world free of toxic pesticides. Under Jay's leadership, Beyond Pesticides has grown to be a significant force in assisting local groups and impacting national pesticide policy. Jay works to track specific chemical effects, regulatory actions, and pesticide law, and his work with media has helped to bring broader public understanding of the hazards of pesticides. And Drew Toher is Beyond Pesticides Community Resource and Policy Director. Prior to his current position, he served as the organization's Public Education Associate for 4 years. And previous to joining the staff of Beyond Pesticides, Drew's experience included working at a certified organic heirloom tomato farm, where he became determined to spread the word about the benefits of organic production and the hazards of pesticide use. Drew is currently pursuing an MS in Environmental Management at George Mason University. Welcome to both of you. And Jay, you may go ahead and begin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Diana, and we appreciate the opportunity to talk today about this incredibly important topic. Let me go to the first slide, which is entitled Rachel Carson, Federal Pesticide Policy. We'll start today talking about policy, and then obviously that we could spend the whole time talking about policy issues. We'll segue into the scientific information that is critical to the work that we'll then next talk about, which is policy change at the local level. But first, we always like to start with Rachel Carson and her work, obviously with Silent Spring, because she really sets a framework for our thinking about how we intersect with toxic chemicals, pesticides in the environment, particularly how they affect biological systems, and the word we hear a lot today, of course, sustainability. Next slide. So we like to, when we talk about both in the policy arena, but also on the practice side, that is how we manage different landscapes and agriculture, we like to go again back to Rachel Carson, talk about complex biological systems, which she did so eloquently. And she said the chemicals may have been pre-tested against a few individual species, but not against living communities. And that'll be our theme today as we move through some of the policy analysis and talk then about the solution and how we get to what Rachel Carson talked about, making wider use of alternative methods. Next slide. So again, the framework is for us as activists and advocates to gain greater understanding of the chemical effects at all levels, whether we're talking about cancer, neurotoxic effects, genetic damage, reproductive effects, and then understand how those chemicals interact in the environment, how they cause insect and weed resistance, and then ultimately what that means for the chemical treadmill, meaning we create increased dependency on toxic chemicals and never break that cycle of dependency and then keep looking for new chemicals and new chemistries to attack resistant insects and weeds. Next slide. As many of you may know, when we're talking about a pesticide, we're really talking about a formulation of chemicals. So you pick up a product at the store, it's being used in the community as a weed killer, an insect control product. We're talking about a range of materials, which include active chemicals that attack the target pest, inert ingredients, which is the formulation in which the chemical sits, and contaminants and purities and metabolites. These are breakdown products. These are chemicals that are either a function of the manufacturing process or can occur when the chemical breaks down in the soil. We're not going to spend a lot of time today on this, but it's important as organizers to understand that the complexity of the chemical mixtures really has to be part of the discussion. So we start with the federal law because that's how a pesticide gets on the market. It has to be registered federally and go through this review process. And when we analyze the actual uses of the chemicals, and their exposure patterns, we see tremendous deficiencies in that federal regulatory process. It is a complex process, but the risk assessments that are used have severe limitations in terms of looking at vulnerable population groups, in terms of looking at this complexity that we're discussing of biological communities, biological systems. There are quirky elements to the law that allow for the actual registration before complete data is generated, and that's called conditional registration. We have this unreasonable adverse effects, what's reasonable, what's not, goes to this risk-benefit calculation. At the same time that we say we look at risks and benefits, we really don't look at product efficacy. So we don't have information on whether the chemical actually works and over what period of time it works. We have inadequate labels and enforcement limitations there. And then we have, on top of all of this, exemptions to the law under emergency conditions where chemicals that are allowed to be used that are not registered for a particular use pattern or they're not registered yet at all. So that's a context in which we have to have a conversation when we're talking at the local or state level because it creates the allowances, it creates the underlying assessments that allow the label to allow the uses that are ongoing on a daily basis. Next slide. So we have to assess the limitations of risk assessment, conditional registration, unreasonable adverse effects. I'm not going to delve into this, but you can, obviously we need to understand these elements to be effective advocates. Next slide. And then on top of these problems with the actual law, we find a whole other series of deficiencies that you might imagine as sort of common sense problems. Not looking at mixtures. We know we're exposed to mixtures, both through food and non-dietary exposure, through water, through occupation, through drift. All kinds of exposures go on. We're not taking that into account. We don't ever look at synergistic effects. We used to years ago look at the synergy between pharmaceuticals and pesticides. That's no longer done. We're not really looking adequately at inerts. We don't look at endocrine disruption, even though a 1996 law required that. We haven't completed that process and established the protocol. We assume compliance, inadequate monitoring, and the bottom line at the end of the day is there are numerous, hundreds of uncertainties really, in terms of the limitations of what we know about the chemicals, what we know about their interactions, and what we should know to have complete understanding about the chemicals. The reason we have on the left EPA and then as an example the state of Hawaii, the Department of Agriculture has authority over the enforcement and registration in the state. Typically that's not the case, I believe, in Alaska, where the Department of Environmental Conservation has jurisdiction over pesticides and registration, I believe. But it varies across the states. Again, most states utilize their Department of Agriculture as the point of primary enforcement authority. So when we're dealing with landscapes, we we have a whole range of chemicals that are used, but we at Beyond Pesticides have identified 30 commonly most used. And we look at the data, and this is what we come up with. It's pretty astounding. 16 are probable possible human carcinogens. 17, did I say next slide? 17 are suspected endocrine disruptors. 12 linked to birth defects. 21 reproductive toxicants. 25 cancer. So these are effects on human physiology. The impacts are, devastating, ranging from short to chronic, short-term acute effects to chronic long-term effects. Next slide. And the same thing's true with environmental contamination. 19 groundwater contaminants, 22 toxic to birds, 30 to fish, and we know a lot now. We're seeing more and more about the bee toxicity to bees. Next slide. We're adversely affecting aquatic microorganisms and plants, amphibians, and fish. Next slide. And then we see deformities. These are things we see in our communities, and they're associated with the chemical we'll be talking about today, glyphosate, as well as atrazine and other herbicides. And then the next slide, the indirect effects of pesticides. Herbicides can cause a reduction in habitat. So this is not a direct effect, but it's an indirect effect that disturbs the ability of the insect population to survive. The newest concern that has been raised, and this has been going on for about a decade now, are the development, more prevalent development, I should say, of systemic insecticides, which means that the chemical is taken up by the vascular system of the plant and then expresses the chemical through the pollen and nectar and glutation droplets, causing what I can only characterize as indiscriminate poisoning of all wildlife. Again, this is an effect that EPA has never adequately studied. Next slide. So we created what we call the pesticide-induced database because we wanted to track what we're seeing in the real world, not just what is tested, what EPA uses for regulation, which is laboratory testing required by the agency and conducted by the manufacturer, by the registrant, those who register pesticides. Next slide. And what we find is 760 entries in our study that link these pesticides to all kinds of public diseases, public health diseases. And we know about cancer, but it really is the full gamut from reproductive problems to Alzheimer's to Parkinson's to learning disabilities. And this is what often gets given short shrift because, you'll read a study like the Stanford University study, and typically what they're looking at are studies that they are done on laboratory animals. And those tend to be, that is the basis for evaluating chemical impacts because we don't test on humans. We're not supposed to test on humans, although we feel like we're all guinea pigs in this great human experiment. But nevertheless, there's a disconnect often between the laboratory animal studies and the public health diseases that we're experiencing in our families and our communities. So that's an interesting approach when you sit down with decision makers to pull out the data and the connections that are being made in terms of the real diseases that we're seeing daily. Next slide. And again, we have these ranges of deficiencies. One of the things I want to stress that doesn't get stressed enough, I think, is that we don't look at product efficacy, pesticide efficacy. We don't do this. We let the marketplace determine whether a pesticide works or not. Next slide. So let's move on to glyphosate as an example of the larger problem. So we know this chemical is a hazardous chemical, both on the acute level and the chronic level, from neurological impacts that express themselves in a range of effects, joint pains, facial numbness, elevated blood pressure, chest pains, congestion, coughing, headache. Hard to distinguish those kinds of effects from the common cold, and that's part of the problem. You don't necessarily associate a glyphosate exposure, which is the most widely used chemical in our residential environment, to these kinds of effects. Neither do you associate them with cancer, fetal development, kidney, liver damage, and the more recent identification of modification of DNA functioning. Next slide. So The study that's gotten a lot of attention in the since 2015, last couple of years, has been this IARC study, International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization. And they came up with really their highest level absent direct human data. And that usually may come from an occupational study where they're tracking occupational exposures. But the next step down, next tier down, group 2A, is the data, the category that IARC calls sufficient evidence of carcinogenicity. And they found that glyphosate fell into this category. And again, with other studies, including the agricultural health study linking glyphosate to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, this is a critical problem. Now, of course, there have been challenges to this study, but this is a preeminent group. And the scientists that are associated with this are really objective scientists, and typically the criticism is coming from the industry side and industry scientists. Now, understand, going back to that slide where we said there are these mixtures of chemicals that make up the formulation, so too is that the case with glyphosate, and we have an ingredient, POEA, which can damage human cells and contribute to the glyphosate product having these adverse effects. Next slide. And then there's the environmental side. We've been doing a lot of work recently on impacts on the microbiota in the soil, which, by the way, has direct links to the gut microbiome. And glyphosate plays an incredible role in disrupting this soil microbiota, because guess what? Glyphosate is patented as an antibiotic. So this is a chemical that we're broadcasting more than any other chemical around our homes, in our parks, around our schools, and it's patented as an antibiotic. So that raises all kinds of questions in terms of what its impact on soil biology is and what that can do to impacts on all kinds of organisms that are living in the soil, living in the water, et cetera. Next slide. And then, of course, the question is, does it even work? And we're seeing resistance in overwhelming numbers. The thing I like to point to the most is 2014, when the Texas Department of Agriculture came in on behalf of cotton farmers, millions of acres of cotton in Texas, and said that glyphosate was no longer working. Literally was no longer working in genetically engineered cotton, which is tolerant to, herbicide tolerant to glyphosate. So here we have a situation. What happens next? Going back to previous slides, these guys come in for an emergency exemption. The emergency exemption allowed them to use this, or would have allowed them to use this chemical on a chemical that has not, to my knowledge, ever been registered for use for terrestrial use. It's propazine, used in waterways, generally at least, and they were asking for it to be used. EPA ended up denying it based on groundwater contamination, but also based on the fact that all the risk criteria were exceeded, or they said were currently exceeded. So you can see the pressure on the regulatory agency. Farmer chooses pesticide not test for efficacy, pesticide fails, farmer left without a tool, farmer applies for an emergency exemption to use a pesticide that's not tested for use on that crop, claiming that they're going to suffer significant economic harm under the Section 18 of FIFRA, the Emergency Exemption Clause. Creates this cycle, and we see this going on year after year. Glyphosate stays, next slide, glyphosate stays around for a while, and we're finding it in honey. We have actually sued a honey producer because of glyphosate residues in the honey, which we can talk about. We talked about systemic and these properties. Corn, soybeans, the two highest use crops for these systemics, and a lot of the application method really revolves around these coated seeds, where they're treated with the chemical. Next slide. So our concern is with this colony collapse disorder that we're seeing around the world, actually, that we're seeing this dramatic decline in bee populations, but also butterflies and birds. So this just a next slide shows you total managed honeybee hives and the loss estimates, which you can see are remaining pretty high. I'm going to skip over this because I want to get to the transition, and then Drew will take over. But neonics are having widespread effects on other wildlife. Next slide. Neonics are having this trophic effect in cascade, and cascading trophic effect. So you're seeing this in studies like out of Penn State, where the seed treatment was affecting predators, and we call them beneficial insects that are necessary in an ecological system. Next slide. Note that we are at odds in the U.S. with findings in the EC, or the European Union, European Commission, as well as with the IARC, which is an international entity, both on glyphosate, IARC, and the European Union neonicotinoids, and the EC, the European Commission, is advising the European Union to extend the ban on neonicotinoids as of last week or 2 weeks ago. Okay, so we want to take all this information and we want to incentivize, next slide, incentivize non-toxic systems. We don't want to institutionalize these products for the reasons we've just discussed. Next slide. We have started to do this through the Organic Foods Production Act, which for us serves as a model for local groups and local ordinances. So the reason we're raising this here is we've got a systems approach embedded now in federal law, which requires compatible systems, agricultural systems that focus on these complex biological systems that Rachel Carson warned us we needed to focus on back in the 1960s. Next slide. So this is a slide from Rodale, their long-term longitudinal study that looks at trials of conventional versus trials of organic, and you can just see the carbon sequestration on the right side versus the dead soil, no microbial life, no organic matter on the left side. Okay, next slide. Washington State has proven that this approach improves soil quality, minimizes energy uses, increases biodiversity, minimizes water pollution. It's just an all-around win. Next slide. And this is the result. This is the kind of field you can get. This is managed by a board member of ours, Chip Osborne, in Marblehead, Massachusetts. Next slide. So now, this is what, once we get this information to the public, we begin a process of, because as environmentalists, we're good at passing policies. We have to become really good at managing the systems that we create with our policies. And this is what we have to manage. We have to manage the soil. If the policy in Alaska is to be successful, the policies across the country are going to be successful, we have to bring this discussion to our communities to carry out these programs. So soil chemistry is the basics. We start with that. I'm going to go through these quickly. We have to protect, next slide, the biomass and microbial activity in the soil with a feed the soil approach. We have to manage that biomass with organic compatible materials. That's managing the biomass. Next slide. We have to account for transition periods. People get a little antsy. You're going to take these chemicals away. Or what are our sites, our parks, our lawns, our landscapes going to look like? Next slide. We have to look at fertility. We've been hooked on synthetic fertility, synthetic fertilizers, and we have to get away from those and go to composting and top dressing and compost tea and humic substances and microbial inoculants and recycling grass clippings. Now, you can't write all this in the law, but you can prohibit, and Drew will talk about this, you can prohibit the bad stuff, and then that creates or incentivizes the movement transition to these alternative materials. And then, of course, we're not just materials-based. We are creating systems that are cycling nutrients naturally, but at the same time, we do that with cultural practices, which are not materials-based. It's irrigation, it's cultivation, it's overseeding, it's mowing. And then we, as Beyond Pesticides, when we go into a community, we do the soil test, we take site photos, we make recommendations on the site, and then we come up with a management schedule for the site, and we do the staff training around that. This is a capacity we need to build in our groups in our communities, in the private sector, in the public sector, and then we'll see, and we are seeing, great success. I turn this over to Mr. Toher. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jay. Thank you very much, and thank you, Diana and Pam and all the good folks at ACAT. Hello, all. Again, I'm Drew Toher, the Community Resource and Policy Director at Beyond Pesticides. In case folks have gotten lost, I'm on, I believe it should be slide 40, the importance of local action. And I'm going to talk about various approaches that communities across the country have taken to limit the use of these toxic pesticides that Jay was just discussing. And since Jay provided a great overview of the hazards these chemicals pose to public health and the environment, and then the viability of their alternatives, I'm going to launch right into a talk about actions that localities have taken to restrict their use. And I'm going to specifically focus on policies that address landscaping, so I'm not going to touch mosquito control or anything like that. But before I get into these issues, I'll first need to get into a quick background about how far localities can actually go in terms of restricting pesticide use in their area. And this is generally driven by state-level laws. In the early 1990s, there was a lawsuit, Mortier versus Wisconsin Public Intervenor, which affirmed that federal law does not preempt or stop local jurisdictions from restricting the use of pesticides more stringently than the federal government. So we can go to the next slide. But in response, the pesticide industry went state by state to pass these state-level preemption laws, which then in fact stopped localities within that state from restricting pesticide use farther than state law. And essentially, localities and states that have pesticide preemption cannot apply local laws to private property in their jurisdictions. Next slide. So Alaska is in fact a state, according to our analysis, that is not subject to pesticide preemption. And we do in fact have an example of a locality within the state asserting this home rule right in Skagway, Alaska, which passed a policy in 2014. There may be some folks in this call that know more about the background and passage, but I think there are some interesting components in this policy that we can use to launch a discussion. So first, Skagway's ordinance was born out of concerns regarding groundwater contamination arising from the use of railway herbicides along railroad tracks. However, during the policy formation process, it was decided that the policy should also address risk to pollinators. So what Skagway's ordinance does is it prohibits both the sale and use of these B-toxic neonicotinoids that Jay discussed in these systemics, and it also bans the use of herbicides that are considered persistent by the U.S. Composting Council, and that is an effort to protect water quality. And these restrictions apply to both public and private property. Skagway's ordinance does go a little bit further and works to encourage healthy land care practices by establishing a list of restricted pesticides and then putting some limits on their use. And I should note as a brief aside that what we're really trying to do and what we're trying to get at here by restricting pesticides is to foster this wholesale change in the way pest control, pest management occurs in a community, as Jay was discussing. By working to eliminate this slate of toxic products, we're attempting to incentivize this reorientation towards the ecological systems, the soil management practices, and have land managers take advantage of that natural pest control system and these ecosystem services by fostering soil biodiversity from the soil up. And so back to Skagway, while their ordinance is good, since its passage, we've actually found that it's both politically and administratively more expedient to encourage a list of allowed rather than restricted pesticides. So we're not trying to restrict pesticides, we're trying to say what pesticides are allowed and least toxic. In other communities we've worked in, these restricted pesticides list, they've run into political trouble because folks don't, local elected officials don't want to reference lists outside the country, like Ontario's Class 9 list of restricted cosmetic pesticides or the EU's list of endocrine disruptors. And a lot of that is because of the deficiencies that Jay discussed earlier in the talk. And we've also run into problems with, administratively, because community and environmental health departments, when we give them a whole list of criteria of toxic pesticides, we find that they balk at the idea of combing through data on pesticide toxicity. And we understand that there are limited resources in local communities to go through each chemical that could be potentially applied and look through this toxicity data. So in our more recent policies that we've encouraged, we've moved towards a list of allowed materials, which includes those, as you'll see on the next slide, that are both certified organic and exempt from federal registration. So these are a list of minimum risk products that EPA puts out that are called 25B products that are considered minimum risk, as well as organic products which undergo a vetted process of evaluation under the National Organic Standards Board, which is an independent stakeholder group. In this way, what we're trying to do is make use of publicly available lists within the United States that can simply be referenced by local regulators, so they don't have to go through this time-consuming process of looking at toxicity data. And to that end, and we can go to the next slide, to that end, we've published in our most recent newsletter a list of end-use pesticide products that fit this allowed use criteria. And you can see that on the next two slides. There are a number of products there, which I hope are able to be read by folks, and we'll certainly send around a link following up on this. You can go to the next slide. And we've seen that, so that's kind of the overview of this allowed list. And we've even seen that in states that don't have preemption, localities are willing to address the private use of pesticides. And we have an example of the city of Tacoma Park as the earliest example. In 2013, they restricted the use of pesticides on both private and public property. And they did use a restricted list similar to Skagway's. But when the issue came before the county in which Tacoma Park is located, which is Montgomery County, and they began to consider their own ordinance, we found that the allowed list was a more palatable approach for the community. And you can go to the next slide. And in 2015, Montgomery County did pass a landmark ordinance protecting over 1 million people from toxic pesticide use on both public and private property. And this has also been seen in the state of Maine. It's another preemption-free state where localities have asserted this home rule right to govern pesticide use on local property. We can go to the next slide there. In Maine, there are over 25 communities that have restricted pesticide use in some way. And the more far-reaching of those, which we have on the slides here, are South Portland and Ogunquit, which do apply to both public and private property. And if you go to the next slide, I'll quickly note that in both Ogunquit and South Portland, it was very helpful to have a local Ace hardware store support these ordinances by eliminating pesticide products on their own store shelves. They really took the lead here. And in fact, the first group of chemicals that they found it was just most simple to eliminate were these systemic neonicotinoid pesticides that are bee harming. And Beyond Pesticides, our organization is working to get other hardware stores involved with this movement and support these safer practices by educating their own customers about organic land care. And to that end, we produced a document that's called the Well-Stocked Hardware Store to help retailers assist with this transition. So we'll go to the next slide. And just to wrap up, I want to note that the passage of these ordinances are not a small task. They take a lot of organizing, they take petitions, community meetings, discussions and deliberations, as many of the folks on this call I'm sure know from your own work. And so in localities where there is pesticide preemption or where addressing pesticide use on private property isn't necessarily feasible at the time, there are communities that have made important impacts on reducing unnecessary chemical use, protecting pollinators, protecting public health, and encouraging these alternatives. And a lot of that focuses on the private side, educating the community. And then on the public side, addressing similarly with these other ordinances, what public agencies, what pesticides public agencies can use. And again, if your state has preemption, these laws are limited to what pesticides can be applied to public, local government-owned land. And we do have some good examples out there, including Cuyahoga County. Go to the next slide. Camden, Maine, which is a good model. They also have an excellent training requirement for land managers built in there, and as well as Irvine, California. And generally, these ordinances look very similar to Montgomery County and South Portland's, but they only apply to public property. And these ordinances are, you can go to the next slide, and you'll see that these ordinances are a growing trend across the country. We recently released a new tool called the Map of U.S. Pesticide Reform Policies, and on that we're listing over 120 communities that have enacted some level of toxic pesticide reform or restrictions. And we hope that more communities will begin to pass these policies, and will put greater pressure on state governments and the EPA to fill in these data gaps that Jay discussed, overturn preemption, or implement state-level restrictions on the use of these toxic pesticides. So with that, I guess I'm going to end a bit early, but I'm going to turn it over to Pam, who I believe will talk about an ordinance that we're very excited about in Anchorage, and we hope to get onto our list, our map soon. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Drew, and thank you, Jay. And now I'd like to invite Pam Miller, Executive Director of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, to discuss the Pesticide-Free Anchorage Ordinance being considered by the Anchorage Assembly.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you, Jay and Drew. That was just so informative, and I just thank you also for all of your inspiring work. So I'll talk a little bit about the ordinance that we're discussing here in Anchorage. It is the intention of this ordinance, which is now numbered AO 2017-59, and it is the intention of this ordinance to protect public health, and especially those who are most vulnerable to the harmful health effects of pesticides. As Jay discussed, we've been concerned that current pesticide registration protocols and regulations under the federal EPA as well as under the state of Alaska are very outdated and certainly not reflective of the latest science, and therefore this leaves gaps in the protection of public health and especially children. The ordinance that we're considering here in Anchorage establishes and codifies a positive and healthy approach that focuses on long-term prevention of pests and their damage. The municipality horticulture program really should be commended for their efforts to minimize the use of pesticides over the past several years. This ordinance simply codifies and establishes a set of guidelines and procedures that ensures that practices are consistently applied through successive administrations and staff. So to craft this ordinance, we worked very hard over the past several weeks with members of the Assembly, the municipal horticulture department, and community members, including pesticide applicators, to craft the ordinance, which again is AO 2017-59. We went through several revisions and a very constructive process, I would say, to consider everyone's perspectives and address concerns. We had a work session with the Rules Committee, and it was approved by the Rules Committee to be introduced on March 21st. There will be another work session on April 7th, and then there will be a public hearing before the Assembly's regular meeting on April 11th. And we have a series of some events that we hope will both inform and engage people here in Anchorage. Tonight, we're showing a film called Stink, which will be at the University of Alaska, Anchorage at 6:30. It's a film about the chemical industry and effects on public health. We're having and it's free and open to everyone. And on March 30th at 6 o'clock, we're having a volunteer night here at Alaska Community Action on Toxics. This is just a chance to come over, have some fun, meet people who are interested in being engaged in local issues and learn more about the work that we do here. On April 3rd, we're going to be making phone calls to people in the community to hopefully motivate them to come out to the public hearing. And we'll also be showing the movie again, Stink, a public screening at the Alaska Experience Theater at 7 o'clock. And then that's also free. And on April 5th, we're having with the Alaska Center some training at 6:30 for people to come out and learn how to testify. If you feel shy about testifying in public, this is a good opportunity to just kind of learn the basics of how to testify before public hearings. And then again on April 11th, the Anchorage Assembly will be having a hearing at their regular meeting on a Tuesday evening. And before I close, I'd also just like to acknowledge, because I think she's on the phone, we had an intern last summer, Sahi Upalapati. She's now a senior at Whitman College, and she worked last summer to help do some of the basic research that led to this ordinance, including looking at models around the country and doing some basic research about the health effects of pesticides. So I just want to thank her and acknowledge her work. And I think I'll stop there. And again, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Pam. And thanks again to Drew and Jay. I know you moved through your presentation pretty quickly so that we would have time for our discussion. So there was a lot in those slides that we didn't cover, and perhaps people have questions and would like to delve into some of those pieces a little bit more. So now is the opportunity for questions and comments from our participants. So if you'd like to ask a question, please press *2 to unmute your line. Please also state your name and affiliation. And if your question is directed to one of the speakers, if you could identify that in your question, that would be helpful. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes, can you go ahead and give your name and affiliation, please?
Yeah, this is Ginger Saunders Mason with Pesticide-Free Zone. And in Marin County, we have a great opportunity in that because we are a preemption state, that our Board of Supervisors has allocated $200,000 for an advertisement campaign to convince people in our community not to use pesticides and not to use particularly glyphosate. I have a question for Jay and Drew in that we have always had a problem with glyphosate in that the county doesn't want to give it up. They put it on the exemption list and they haven't used it for a year, but they still want to go back to glyphosate for some reason, or be able to depend on it. What is a very good substitute if they have to use a product, which they sometimes still think they have to use? What is a product out there that really works, that will take the place of glyphosate? Thank you.
Okay, you're going to get both of us on this. Thank you, Ginger, for that question. This is Jay. So Drew will follow up, but obviously glyphosate is used in different contexts. It's used in hardscaping, cracks in sidewalks. It's used around fence posts, fences, edging. It's also used in ornamental beds, and it can even be used as spot treatment in a turf system as well. So it really depends on the use pattern. That is, the response depends on the use pattern. Generally, as we approach this, and when we talk with communities, we start out by saying that a sustainable, and we talk about sustainable organic program is not a product substitution program, that it's an integrated program where we're looking holistically at how we manage the soil. So if we're talking about the ornamental beds or the turf, how do we manage that? All those things we talked about in the presentation around cultural practices and, whether we're talking about aeration, dethatching, proper ecological balance. We want to have good soil health so we get good plant health that's less vulnerable to disease and infestation. Hardscaping is a whole different topic because there, you've got your design already, so you're confronted with, we have to work within the parameters of the design, and then you're looking for product-specific alternatives. That is not to say in the first scenario that they're not products, and Drew will mention some of those, but in the hardscaping, we are talking about hot water, believe it or not, these foaming machines that are used successfully, hot water foam, as well as horticultural vinegar and other acidic type products. But Drew's been working on sort of aligning the statutes, these local ordinances, with compatible products that align with the statutory language.
That's right, and thanks, Jay. And if you'll see, it should be on about slide 44. We do get this question a lot, and we still make the argument that Jay was discussing. I mean, the focus that we really want to have here is on building a system that is more resilient to pest and weed pressure in the first place. However, we do acknowledge that even during a transition period, for instance, there may be the need for some actual products in order to control these weeds. Certainly, that is understandable. And to that end, we've worked to fit, based on this allowed materials list that I mentioned earlier, we've worked to find out what those products are and really list them, and so that land managers have a resource that they can look to for products that they may want to employ as an alternative to something like glyphosate, which certainly carries these inherent risks that are unacceptable for many communities. I would point out that if you take a look at the list of products that are compatible with organic landscapes that we have there, you will find a number of herbicides that are viable and certainly effective. Some of these are vinegar-based or herbicidal soaps. I will point out a product called Halo, which is one of the first selective organic herbicides, 25B minimum risk herbicides that are on the market. It does have selective properties, which is certainly something that land managers have been looking for. Other products are similar to glyphosate in that they are non-selective and can be used to, they will burn grass essentially. So I would definitely encourage folks, when you get that question from land managers, to reference our list of products, and you will see that there are a wide number of alternatives that are available and effective, and we have heard good good responses from landscapers on some of these products.
Great, thank you, Drew. And let's see, we still have some time for questions. So again, press *2 to unmute your line, and then state your name and affiliation.
Hi, this is Karen Dillman, Forest Service on the Tongass. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Oh,
yeah.
Go ahead. Was I?
No, I can hear you. I just barely. Like, if you could speak up a little bit, it would probably be helpful.
Okay.
That's better.
So, okay. My question. This is a great presentation. My question is for those really tough weeds. Japanese knotweed is a big one that we're trying to really get a handle on in some of the communities. So, does your group have a list of species like weeds that could respond to a less toxic application of like glyphosate? Or do you have, I know you have the list of insecticides and herbicides to use that are organic, but do you have then a flip side of a list of species that have been tried with some of these products that might be able to, people could try?
Yes. Thank you. That's the kind of question that we all have to be able to answer because people want solutions to problems, right? Yes, we have something we call Read Your Weeds, and it's a document that actually goes through the different common weed species and then, how we respond. But the reality is that, and Japanese knotweed's a great example, it's really a symptom of a problem. It's a symptom of compaction. It's a symptom of some imbalance in the soil chemistry, that has occurred. So and this is sort of what Drew and I have both been saying, when you develop a systems approach to, is this in a turf? Is this like in a park or a
no, it's roadside. You know, it's where people dump. You know, they take it out of their
lawn,
dump it on the highway, and then we've got, you know, lines, you know, huge infestations of it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Again, roadsides are. I didn't mention roadsides. You know, they're a whole nother area, and as are rangeland and even forested areas. And we have been using. It hasn't come up yet today, but we've been using goats a lot, very successfully in managed grazing situations. We just completed a 300-acre project on the Washoe Reservation outside Carson City, Nevada, and you know, this is a situation which, to a T, sort of follows my presentation. Weed emerges. It's invasive. You know, we throw a chemical at it, the weed becomes resistant to the chemical, and then everybody is left there with a greater infestation, at which point we come in, you know, we're coming in because they finally realize that what we're doing is not working. It's not sustainable. We're just not keeping up with the problem. And the goats create a systems approach in the sense that they not only, you know, take that weed out, but they aerate the soil, they fertilize the soil, they create an opportunity to reseed with native vegetation, and again, create that whole systems approach. Now, we do talk about this transition, and Drew mentioned it as well. And Drew, you may want to talk about some of the chemicals that are available for that.
Sure. I think I'm going to echo a little bit of what you said. In addition to our Read Your Weeds, you know, fact sheet, I'll note that we also have a resource called Manage Safe, and certainly have Japanese knotweed on this Manage Safe page. And you know, even when, you know, we are talking about you know, in invasive species, we're not, you know, in a situation where we're managing a, you know, a grass environment. We still want to look at what are the conditions that are bringing about the proliferation of this weed in the first place. And we know that you know, Japanese knotweed will thrive in full shade. You know, it'll thrive in higher temperatures. And so what we really want to focus on is alleviating the conditions that have created this weed to be there and then proliferate in the first place, and use these least toxic chemicals that we've discussed. Again, as a last resort, even these least toxic chemicals, we really want to put a focus on the cultural practices, mechanical controls that can, you know, biological controls like goats that could potentially alleviate this problem without resorting to the use of a product which can, you know, even organic chemicals can undermine some sort of soil system that we're trying to build. So we really want to save these as a kind of final last you know, approach. However, I will say that, you know, general good practice in terms of you know, spraying using these least toxic herbicides is to get a weed when it's young, to get a weed when there is full sun, so that you know, you have a better burn, and potentially even do, you know, if it's feasible, if it's economically feasible and feasible in terms of labor and service, to do a run through with a mechanical control like a weed whacker, and then spray it down to really get better control.
Great. Thank you. We have about, I would say, 3 more minutes of questions, and then I have some wrapping up comments to make. So I think we could take 1 or 2 brief questions. Again, *2 to unmute your line. And if you've already asked a question, if you can press *2 to mute your line again, just to reduce any background noise.
This is John Kennish.
Hello?
Hi, this is John Kennish. I'm a retired professor, chemistry professor from UAA. And I thought the most interesting thing about this discussion was the retailers who were modifying what they offer for their clients. And I was wondering whether or not anyone has worked on this in Alaska with the local retailers.
Great question. Pam, do you know the answer to that?
We have not. We hope to, through just general education about the wide range of alternatives that can be used in healthy cultural practices, that we reduce the the need for pesticides. But we have talked about working with some of the local retail stores on this, certainly. Good question, John. Thank you.
I think we can take one more question. So if anyone else would like the opportunity, press *2 to unmute your line. Okay, well then, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. If you think of a question afterwards, you can feel free to send it to me.
There was one more. I think I just got unmuted.
There was?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
If we have the time. This is Gino Graziano. I'm with UAF and the Cooperative Extension Service, and I wanted to ask about, I saw some things about training for organics and then inclusion of IPM in many of these, and I wondered how as far as there's like a whole spectrum of how much can be required in those ordinances, and especially with regards to like IPM and then training for organic practices, and what do you guys what have people seen as successful in these other places? Because I imagine that I've read ordinances where they're really based like solely on IPM, and it's very laid out. You got to have a coordinator, etc. And then there's some that maybe give it a mention or a nod. And so, what's your take on including that, and how much to put in there?
Thank you. That's a great question. The more specific it can be in legislation, my belief is the better the legislation is, because obviously legislation, once passed, is open to interpretation. And you're right, IPM, in many cases is laid out in very specific terms, and an IPM coordinator is central to the success of typical IPM programs. But like anything else, it's in the definition. We've seen great IPM programs, and we've seen very poor IPM programs. An IPM program that says judicious use of pesticides, or even pesticides as a last resort, without defining the practices and the allowable materials, can lead to failure or lead to continuing dependency on those toxic chemicals. So we're trying to start with the simple, have legislators feel comfortable with the idea that they're doing something outside of what is the norm in terms of EPA allowances. They're adopting something more stringent than both the state and the federal government. And they have to first feel comfortable with the science and the fact that they're not alone. And then, depending on the point you get to with the legislative body, the level of specificity sort of becomes a political decision by the organizers and by the sponsors. But our finding, as Drew explained, our experience is that if you create an allowed product list, allowed materials list, which by implication means you have a prohibited list, the flip side of that is you cannot use everything else, that allowed list really defines the limitations of the program, or I should, to say it differently, it defines the opportunities of the program to become organic, because you can't manage a conventional system, a conventional chemical reliance system, without the highly toxic materials. And you can't manage an organic system just based on allowed materials. You've got to adopt a systems approach. It's not difficult. It's being done across the country. There's a lot of expertise now in communities all over the U.S. And so it's, I guess the quick answer to all of this is define whatever terms you're using. Do that in a way that is as specific as possible. But at the end of the day, the key thing is to create an allowed list. That's the bottom line, so that we prohibit the use of hazardous chemicals around our kids, as Pam said, in particular, but also around all the other vulnerable people in the community with pre-existing health conditions and people during developmental stages of life, elderly. These are the exposure patterns that we want to eliminate in our community through the adoption of organic management practices.
Thank you for your question, and thank you for your response, Jay. I do believe we are out of time. I just have a few quick announcements. I do want to thank everyone for joining us again today. That's our presenters and our participants. This call was recorded and will be available. I will send out a link probably tomorrow, along with a few links to some of the additional resources that were mentioned during the call and a list of all of those great events coming up in Anchorage. Our next Che Alaska call will be on Wednesday, April 26th with Molly Kyle, Associate Professor at Oregon State University's College of Public Health and Human Sciences, and she'll be presenting her research team's findings on the developmental consequences for young children of exposure to flame retardant chemicals. Let's see, what else? Again, there's a host of events occurring. If you missed any of those, give the ACAT office a call at 907-222-7714 for more information. And let's see. Yeah, I think that about does it for today. We thank you all very, very much for joining us. And I wanted to also mention that the complete language of the Pesticide-Free Anchorage Ordinance was included in a link to that document that I had sent to everyone as well, if you're interested in looking at that a little bit more closely. I'd also like to ask you to consider making a donation to Alaska Community Action on Toxics in support of our monthly Che Alaska teleconferences. And whatever you are able to contribute makes a difference. You can contribute online at www.akaction.org. Thanks again to everyone. Have a wonderful day.